Good morning, good tava. Today is Sunday. Today we are learning the last Perek of Dalid. Oops, that's better. Today we're learning the last Perek of Dalid of Perek of Shabbos. We're doing this the whole month. Baruch Hashem, we have a month full of Shabbos, and as we wrap up Perek of Shabbos, there's always plenty more to learn about Shabbos. But maybe be able to tap into the brachas of Shabbos all the days of our lives. Baruch Hashem. Today's shir is sponsored Lila Nishma Saranachim ben Simcha Cohen, Yeshua Mordechai ben Sheps, Bracha Sabar Shmuel Leib ben Moshe ben Yosef ben Nishma will have an aliyah. And before Shlema for Ada Sar Bas Lechan Pesel Bas Yenta, Yisrael ben Rachel Rachel Bas Pesel Zelda, Avram Yisrael ben Risha, and Chaya Bas Dobebela. Before Shlema so Shar Chali Yisrael. Okay, here we go. Perek of Dalit, the last one to go. Tomorrow we start Eruvin, Mr. Shem. Mishnah Aleph. Mi shehechshif b'derech. One who's on the road as it gets dark on Friday realizes that he will not reach the town before Shabbos. We actually we've had this, practically speaking, for many years when it snows on a Friday, and people get stuck on the road getting to what they have to do for Shabbos, and this falls into place, like what to do with their stuff and how to handle it. And we got very lucky this past Friday with the snow in New York and New Jersey, because the snow only started around 5 o'clock after Shabbos had already started. And there was much more manageable to deal with. Had the snow started earlier in the day, like 12, 1, 2 o'clock, it would have been a much more difficult situation to handle with. But Baruch Hashem, the snow started when Shabbos started, and it was much more manageable. Okay, anyways, so someone was on the road when it gets dark on Friday night, and he's not going to reach the town before Shabbos. Noticing Kisel Nachri, he may give his purse, his wallet, his money bag, his possessions to a non-Jew to carry into town for him, put into a taxi or whatever. Although one is generally Although it's generally assur on Shabbos but by din derbanan to Amir Akum is generally in the derbanan, to have a non-Jew perform melacha for you on Shabbos. In this case, the Chachamim were mekum, as it's a shasat chak, and they didn't want to rule that the person should abandon his possessions on the side of the road, because they understood that, like, it's a very hard nisayon for people to handle, and they're going to violate the halacha. So therefore, they put in a leniency that they can give it to a goy, to a non-Jew, to bring into town for them. And if there is no non-Jew with him, like there's no non-Jew in sight, he may place the purse on his donkey to carry it for him. Generally, using an animal to carry an item through a Evishes Harabim on Shabbos is assur, but again, in this case, they monitored it so as not to, they monitored the din derbanan so as to avoid any issur d'oraisa over here. Yeah, it's a big topic over here, and consult your local Orthodox rabbi for more details about this practically. I mean, how you compare a donkey to a car now? No one drives a donkey anymore. Can you leave your stuff in the car and get to town like after Shkia on Friday? That's a question. It's a big question. When he reaches the outermost courtyard of the city and he begins to unload his donkey, he may take off any kelim that may normally be moved on Shabbos, meaning the items that are not muktzah. However, the muktzah items, which are not allowed to be used on Shabbos, he cannot remove them by hand. Matir es hachavalim shukin nofen meleha. Instead, he unties the ropes that attaches them to the saddle, and the sacks fall down on their own. What this would apply in today's generation, when you have cars, and we take the Shabbos stuff out and leave the muktzah stuff in the car. Not really sure. Because when last year saw anybody ride a donkey around the major Jewish population centers. Not too often. Mishnah Beis Matirin Pikiye Amir Lifnei Behema. We may untie bundles of straw tied at both ends for an animal to eat. Yes, since the animal cannot eat the straw while it is tied at both ends, it is mutter to untie the bundles of Shabbos in order to make them edible. But scattering the straw after untying it, so that it will release an appetizing scent for the animal to smell, is assur, since the animal will eat the straw even if this is not done. So therefore, there's no need to do it, and therefore it's assur. Additionally, we can untie and even scatter soft cedar branches for an animal to eat, because the animal will not eat them unless they are scattered so that it can smell them. Therefore, scattering them makes them edible and is permitted on Shabbos. However, we may not scatter triply bound bundles of straw that are tied at both ends and the middle for an animal. Although when the straw is tied in three places and then packed tightly together, it becomes unappetizing and the animal will not eat it. Still, once it's untied, an animal will eat it, and it's not necessary to scatter the straw in order to spread its scent. Therefore, it is assur to go to the effort of scattering it. The a maraskim lo es hashachas lo es hacharuvin is behema. One may not shred fodder or soft carobs for an animal because these items are tender enough to be edible without being shredded. Therefore, although shredding fodder and carrots makes them easier for the animal to eat, this preparation is assur and Shabbos because it involves unnecessary effort. Being daka, being gasa, and it makes no difference whether it is a small animal or a large animal. Either one is capable of eating fodder or carobs, even if they are not shredded. Therefore, regardless of the size of the animal, it is assur to shred fodder or carobs for it. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin adaka. However, Rabbi Yehuda permits shredding carobs for a small animal. Okay, Mishnah Gimel. Continuing with feeding methods for the animals of Shabbos, because they involve significant effort. Ein osin es hakamal. We may not force feed a camel large amounts of food or even small amounts of food on Shabbos by pushing the food down the camel's throat far enough that it can no longer bring the food back up. Since this involves significant effort, it's prohibited on Shabbos. Alitin, however, he may put food down its throat to a point from which the camel can still bring it back up, because this does not involve significant effort. And one may not fatten calves by force feeding them, but one may put food down their throats up to the point from which they can still bring it back up. Halktin, Tarnagolim, and one may also put food down the throats of chickens up to the point from which they can still bring it back up. Notice the my Lamorson. One may put water into bran for animals. Of a low govin, but one may not need the bran and water together. Merely adding water to the bran is not considered kneading. Which is one of the 39 melachos. However, kneading bran and water together, stirring them, is assur because this does violate the melacha of kneading. lifnei devorim, lifnei yonim shebeshuvach. One may not place water before bees that he is raising, or before doves in a dovecote to drink, because these creatures are capable of finding water on their own. Providing them with water on Shabbos is therefore assur. Aval noshnin lifnei avzim b'tarnagolim ulifnei yonei hardisios. However, one may place water for geese, chickens, and Herodian pigeons. There you go. Hardisios is Herodian pigeons from Herod. Why are they called Herodian pigeons? Because they're a type of dove that was named after King Herod, who raised doves of this type in his palace. So you can raise these birds, because these creatures he can place water before these birds because these creatures are dependent upon him for their food and water and are unable to find their own food on their own. Being them on Shabbos is therefore mutter. Mishnah Dalet. So in addition to how much one can exert himself in order to feed his animals on Shabbos, there's a question of whether certain foods may be fed to an animal on Shabbos if they're not designated as animal food before Shabbos. We'll see that this question involves a far-reaching dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda that we have encountered several times to the extent of the muktzah prohibition. So, Mishnah Dalet, we may cut up raw gourds on Shabbos for an animal to eat because they are not muktzah. Gourds are normally eaten by people rather than animals, and since they must be cooked in order to be eaten, raw gourds are not permitted for the normal use on Shabbos. Nevertheless, the raw gourds are not muktzah because they can be eaten by animals. They are therefore considered prepared for this use on Shabbos, even though this is not their normal use. We may also cut up an animal that died on Shabbos for dogs to eat because it is not muktzah. The normal use for a live animal is to be slaughtered and eaten by people, as the slaughtering is assur on Shabbos, and the animal is not prepared for its ordinary use when Shabbos began. In spite of this, the carcass is not muktzah because the animal could die on Shabbos and thereby become usable as dog food. It is therefore considered prepared for this use, even if when it was alive at that beginning of Shabbos, whereas the animal that had to be shechted was not considered mutter on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Im lo hasten avail Shabbos assur." Rabbi Yehuda, he disagrees. He says, if it was not already dead before Shabbos, if the animal died on Shabbos, we may not cut it up on Shabbos because it's not something that was prepared for the dog's use and is there for a muktzah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the object is considered prepared only if it was fit to be used for its ordinary purpose when Shabbos began. The normal use of a living animal is to be slaughtered and eaten by people, not dogs. Since this animal was alive when Shabbos began, it could not be slaughtered on Shabbos. It was not considered prepared. Therefore, even when it died on Shabbos, it is not only fit for animals, it is not considered prepared and is muktzah, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And the last Mishnah of the Perek of Shabbos, and obviously the Perek of Shabbos, this Mishnah, hey, we may annul vows. A husband can annul a vow of his wife, and a father may annul his daughter's vows on Shabbos. We know from Parshas Matos that a man may annul his wife's vow, a wife's or his daughter's vow, only on the day he hears it. Therefore, if he hears of the vow on Shabbos, he can annul it on Shabbos itself until Shkia. Therefore, the Chachamim mattered annulling vows on Shabbos, even if the vows did not prohibit anything necessary for Shabbos. Since after Shabbos they can no longer annul the vow, annulling it on Shabbos is not considered to be an unnecessary exertion. You can even argue that's even for like covered Shabbos, because he's going to be so bothered by the vow that they took, and it's going to cost him a lot of money in order to fulfill those vows. So it'll be an onyx Shabbos for him to know the vows and give him more ruchas nefesh. When they shall in the dvarim shehin tzorech Shabbos, when they ask you an expert or a court of three judges to release us from vows made to abstain from things that are necessary for Shabbos. Unlike annulling a vow, which may be performed on the day that the vow was first heard, asking for release from a vow, a taras nadarim has no time limit. I may therefore seek a release from a vow on Shabbos only if it was necessary for the sake of Shabbos. Otherwise, it is assur because it is unnecessary exertion on Shabbos. Or we may temporarily shutter a window on Shabbos with a board that is not attached to it. Since the board is being added only temporarily to the structure, it does not appear like the melacha of building. A modadin as hamatlis, and we may measure a rag to determine whether it is large enough to transmit tumah, as hamikvah, and we may also measure a mikvah to determine whether it is large enough to be a valid mikvah. Although usually measuring is an essay on Shabbos because it resembles a weekday activity, the Chachamim allowed it for the purposes of a mitzvah, since the measurements in this case are needed to determine the legal status of the rag and the mikvah. They are considered measurements for a mitzvah. It ends off with a story. The Maisa b'yemei Avishol Tzaddik Rabbi b'yemei Avishol ben Bitnis. There was a story in the days of Tzadik's father and Avishol ben Bitnis. The story was that there were two houses with a narrow alley between them. The two roofs were connected by a barrel that reached over the alley from one house to the other. In one of these houses, a man was laying dying, and as a result, the residents of the second house were worried that when he died, tumah would spread through a window of his house into the alley, and from there through a window into their house. To prevent tumah from entering the second house, its residents shuttered the window in their house that faced the alley with an earthenware container. However, this might not have been necessary because the barrel that connected the two roofs had a gap of unknown size in it. If it was larger than a tefach, then the tumah would be unable to travel past the gap. Therefore, after plugging the window, the residents attempted to check the size of the gap to see if they could safely remove the earthenware container from their window. The kashu as hamakeda v'gami. So they measured an earthenware vessel to see that its width was exactly a tefach wide, and after doing so, they tied it to a stick with a strand of regrass and then thrust it upward to see if the vessel would fit through the gap in the barrel. Leda im yesh begigis poseach tefach imla. This would determine whether or not the gap in the barrel that was overhanging the alley was a tefach wide. Went to Rehem, Lamanu Shepokakin, Abodin, the Koshrim B'Shabbos. From this story, we learn that one may do the following three things on Shabbos. Number one, he may temporarily shutter a window, as they did with the earthenware container in the window of the second house. Number two, one may measure to determine the legal status or to perform some other mitzvah, as it did with the tefach wide vessel. And number three, they may tie a temporary knot, as they did with the regress. Hajj Shabbos, Shabbos, and tomorrow we will continue. We will begin Seches Erevin. Have a wonderful day and be well and be safe.